I'll get different values. I'll get the appropriate index because it enclosed memory around the value that I gave it at that point in time. Another way to write this code that looks maybe less crazy is to still do the function that returns the function, but give it a name and then do it this way. They both behave the same way, but this maybe looks a little bit less crazy. So just know when to use closures. If you see weird behavior in your code, especially with click events or event handlers, that's not having the right values they expected, then you might need to introduce a closure. And that's about where I'm going to leave that. The last point is it's considered bad practice to keep your variables and functions in the global scope. As I mentioned before, one, if you don't declare your variables at all, they're going to be in the global. Anyone could access it. Other libraries could access it. Or if you just declare a variable at the very top of your page, any library could access it, which is bad. Because, and you might not know this, not only could you conflict with another library, but you could conflict with a Chrome extension, Firefox add-on. Like, you might not know this, but if you were to look at my Google Chrome and I show you the debug window and show the scripts, if I click down scripts to try to debug my stuff, I'll see all the JavaScript for all the other plugins that are installed in my browser. And so you could conceivably clash with their names as well. So that's why, in Java, you have namespaces to try to prevent collisions of names. So you want to do the same thing in JavaScript. But a lot of people don't know that you could do that. So here's a lot of bad ways to do stuff. One, at just the very top, just declare a variable. That's global. Actually, not defining a variable at all is global. You'll see people just putting functions at the root level of their page. Those are considered global. Another library could call it. You might see some people try to get fancy and try to make their name really unique. So they'll have, user group underscore function, like to try to make it really unique. But that's still on the global namespace. And unfortunately, I see a lot of code like that. And there's a lot better ways to do it. And as you can tell, everything I just defined above is all accessible off the window because they're all global. And we don't want that at all. So I'm going to show you four ways to get around this. Each has their pros and cons. The easiest one is to use an object literal. And we kind of saw this already when I showed you how to make a new object. So this one, this is considered your namespace. So this one will be global, just like I showed you before. But everything that we want to use under it is off of that variable or object. And so we're going to have a skillet object, and it's going to have a property and a function. And so these are going to be public. Anybody could call them at any time. And so this is a skillet object. I could call ingredient and get bacon strips. I could fry it. The cool thing is you could add new properties after the fact. So I'm going to add a quantity, and I could print that out. And I could add other functions anytime I want that weren't initially defined. But everything's going to be always public. But the good thing about this technique is there's only one global variable, which is skillet, which is whatever your namespace is. This is probably the easiest thing to do. It cleans up the global namespace, so you only have one. You could add functionality at a later point, and everything's public, which you might consider a con. Another con is the syntax is slightly different. Like you have a colon here instead of equals, and you have to remember to put a comma here. And it looks a lot like JSON if you know what JSON is, but it's different. So you might not like that. And there's no concept of private properties or variables. The next approach that we're going to take makes everything private. There's no way to have public. And so in this technique, actually, there is no global variables, which is kind of crazy. we're going to introduce a concept called self-executing anonymous functions, which is a really crazy term, but what it means is we have a function with no name, and we're going to immediately call it after we defined it. And so after this point, there's no way to reference that code you just ran, because there's no name. So if we have any properties or functions, these are private. No one could call them ever again. But what I do at the very bottom is I call something to run at least once. And so if you want some JavaScript code that only runs once and no one could ever call it again, this would be a way to do it. So if we tried to reference ingredients or frying after the fact, they'll all be undefined because there's no way to get that at all. You won't see that too much, but there might be a case for it. The pros, it hides everything. You may want something to learn once, and the syntax looks a little bit easier. You got the equals and semicolons like you're used to, so that's a little bit nicer. The bad thing is, if everything's hidden, you might not want to do that. And it's slightly more confusing. This freaks people out, seeing this called immediately, but you get used to it. So the next approach is kind of a combination between the two. Now you have public and private properties and methods. This is called the revealing module pattern. It still uses the technique that we just saw where we have a function with no name and we call it immediately. But the difference between this is we return something at the end. Last time we just called something, but now we're returning something. We're returning an object. I called it pub as an abbreviation for public, but the trick for this one is anything I add to pub, like pub fry and pub ingredient, anything I add to that, it will be returned, and those will be public. But anything that's not appended to that object that I'm returning, amount of grease or just whatever, will be private and only accessible to functions inside this scope. And so just like the object literal, this becomes your namespace. And so in this case, I have one variable in our global namespace called skillet, and I could call ingredient and fry as public. But if I tried to access, I don't think I'm trying to do that. If I tried to access the private ones, it wouldn't let me. A benefit of this technique is I could still add additional functionality after the fact. So I'm adding a toString function. Oh yeah, this one blows up. So I'm adding a toString function that references public properties, but I'm trying to access the amount of grease, which is private, up here, and it's not going to let because it's private. So there's, so that's probably good. You don't want someone to, well, I'm going to add a new crazy function and try to access all your private parts. So you can't do that, which is good. So the pros are you have private and public properties and methods. The code's easier to read because you could oops, crazy. Sorry, my slides got crazy. You still have the equal. It doesn't look like that very first example with the colon, commas. You got the equals and the semicolons like you're used to. But the downside is, if you wanted to add private functions or properties later, you couldn't. So this is the very last concept in this whole presentation. This is probably the most flexible approach to handling all this, and this is the technique you'll see in like hardcore JavaScript libraries. So it still uses the function with no name that's called below, but this time instead of just open paren, close paren like we've showed all the time, we're passing some things in. So here's some crazy piece of code, which when I saw it the first time, I'm like, what in the world does that mean? The intention of this, let's say you have a library that has lots of components across multiple JavaScript files, but you want all of them to share the same namespace. Here's how you would do it. So what this is doing is like, oh, we're going to have skillet namespace. Because remember, we could access global things off the window. But we're going to have this skillet in the global. But we're going to use falsy values like we talked at the very first concept. So if the namespace skillet doesn't exist, if it's falsy, then initialize it with a new object. So the very first time it's called, that's what it's going to do. Let's assume one of these has already been loaded. The second time someone tries to do this, skillet will have a value, so it will just assign that value to the same value. And then it passes that in as skillet. And so at that point, you add your additional functionality and all that crazy stuff. We'll look in a second how to do that. The second parameter we pass is jQuery. Other JavaScript libraries do use the $sign. So it's considered good practice to not to protect against the $sign. And so by passing the full name of jQuery as your argument and using the $sign as a parameter, now we could use $sign in our code here and not be afraid of it conflicting with another competitor library. And then this is a trick, and I'll explain what it is. You'll notice there's no third argument, but I have a third parameter called undefined. Unfortunately, JavaScript, it has a series of reserved words, but undefined is not one of them. So some malicious person, or someone who doesn't know what they're doing, could define undefined as true. And that would screw up all your code because undefined is one of those falsy values, and so if it's set to true, it could screw up everything. And so if you have a parameter that wasn't passed, then it gets defaulted to the value of undefined. So by having the third one here and not passing anything to it down here, it automatically gets defaulted to the value that you want it to be. So undefined will be undefined always. So you could use undefined in your code, and you're sure that it's going to be undefined. So it's just a trick to protect against malicious or unknowing people. So the technique is just the same as the one before. Anything you want to be public, you append to this namespace that you pass in. So ingredient will be public, fry will be public, but anything that we don't append to the namespace will be private. So is hot is private, add item is private. The cool thing about this is you could have another set of code, just like I showed you, that uses that same technique to build up that library. And so now I could actually add new methods, new public methods, but also I could have private properties that I'm adding to this library. That this function could use that private property. And so it's a way you could build up things up nicely. And this one has the most benefits. I guess the con would be it's more confusing, but the benefits, you have public and private properties and methods. The code inside of it looks normal. It protects against malicious undefined people. It protects the $sign against jQuery. And you can build up libraries across multiple files. And it's a common technique you should be aware of, because if you ever look at source code of libraries, that's what you'll see. So I showed you 4 techniques to protect against the global namespace. I wouldn't always say pick the last one. The first one might be fine, and it's quick and easy, but it helps you not conflict with other libraries or other plugins. So I would just say be wise in what you do. Yes, and so almost everything I've talked about tonight, you're wondering, okay, am I making those mistakes? Well, this tool right here alone will almost tell you everything I told you not to do. It will pinpoint them. So, for example, let's go to, I have a file in here, bad JavaScript code, which is a combination of code from this presentation. So if you go to jslint.com, actually let's just go to jslint.com instead of running it. So Douglas Crockford wrote this tool. He's the one who came up with the JSON language, which serialized JavaScript. You just run it, it will give you a bunch of errors. And so most of these we talked about. Instead of using the not equals, I expected the not double equals, which is exactly what we told you. Instead of using the double equals, I expected the triple equals, which is what we talked about. Instead of using a new object, why don't you use the object literal notation? Instead of using new array, why don't you use the array literal notation? Here's a good one. Instead of using, when you're using a for in, make sure to use the if statement to test. It's the has own property thing we talked about. The error message is a little confusing, but when you know the technique that we talked about, it makes more sense. It warns about global variables. The cool thing, it recognizes global variables. Let's make this bigger. It will say, okay, I found all these things in the global. And if you'll notice, I told you this is a way some people try to protect their function names by prepending it with a namespace. It's still global even if you prepended something to it. So anyway, this is a really good tool to use. Actually, when you first run it, it's really funny. It says JSLint will hurt your feelings because it's very strict. Some people, I use this as a guideline. I'll run it on my code. There's some things I'm like, okay, that's all right, but it's a sanity check. And there's some settings you can alter, but overall, it's a really good tool just to pinpoint some of those problems you might have. So some additional resources. I already mentioned Douglas Crockford. He wrote that tool. He wrote a book called JavaScript: The Good Parts, where he explains there's certain things that you shouldn't ever use in JavaScript, like the eval or the with statement. And then he shows you the good parts, and he explains most of these concepts I've talked about. If you don't like to read, then most everything is in a video series on Yahoo. It's called Crockford on JavaScript. There's like a 4 or 5 part series. Each one's like an hour long, but he goes over these concepts and a lot more. Very smart guy. Actually, Script Junkies, even though it's Microsoft backed, they have a new website called Script Junkies, where most of the articles aren't related to Microsoft at all. It's like JavaScript tools, libraries, CSS. There's some good articles on what closures are, goes in more detail, and prototypes and stuff. A little plug for me. I'm trying to present this at a conference, a Microsoft conference, so if you could vote for me, that would be appreciated. bit.ly etm-mix11-vote. I spoke at it last year as a write-in. They're currently voting, and the top 10 people get picked. And again, if you feel free to email me, Elijah.Manor. I'm on Twitter, ElijahManor, ElijahManor.com.
Is it an online conference or?
No, it's in Vegas. If you've ever heard of PDC, it's kind of like PDC but smaller. Usually more techie people. Well, technical people go to PDC as well, but